Você que tá ouvindo esse podcast, quer saber por que o Senac EAD é o melhor pra você?
Com certeza. Diga!
Além de ser reconhecido nacionalmente pela atuação em educação profissional de qualidade, o Senac EAD conta com mais de 400 cursos entre livres, técnicos, graduação, pós-graduação, extensão universitária e programa de aprendizagem e mais de 390 polos próprios em todo o país.
Ah, e não pode esquecer de falar que ainda por cima é nota máxima no MEC.
Tá vendo? Quer saber? Senac EAD. Acesse ead.senac.br e saiba mais.
This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. The small town of West Memphis, Arkansas, sits on the fringe of the Mississippi Delta, where the slow-moving river winds its way through a land of cotton fields, swamps, and thick woods. It was a place where life moved at a deliberate pace, where neighbors still knew one another, and where the past, both its triumphs and tragedies, cast long shadows. But in May of 1993, something happened that would forever change the small town, rippling far beyond its borders to captivate the attention of a nation and beyond. It was a story of murder, of justice miscarried, and of 3 boys, known to the world as the West Memphis Three, whose fate would become the subject of a decades-long battle between truth and the limits of human belief. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to the West Memphis Three. On the afternoon of May 6, 1993, the bodies of 3 young boys were found in a ditch in a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills, a place where children often played in the shadow of the towering Arkansas trees. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, all 8 years old, had gone missing the previous day. When searchers discovered them submerged in a shallow, muddy stream, they knew immediately that something unspeakable had occurred. The crime scene was horrifying. The boys had been stripped naked, their hands and feet bound with their own shoelaces. Their bodies bore the marks of violence. Stevie Branch and Michael Moore had suffered multiple injuries, while Christopher Byers had been mutilated in a way that suggested to investigators something even darker, something ritualistic. The shock that hit West Memphis was immediate and palpable. The town, already weathered by the challenges of poverty and a high crime rate, was plunged into a new nightmare. As word of the killings spread, fear and suspicion began to grip the town. People spoke of evil that must have descended upon them. Mothers clutched their children a little tighter, and fathers whispered in hushed tones about the possibility of predators hiding in plain sight. It was a place where the undercurrent of religious fervor was ever present, and the brutality of the murders led many to suspect that something demonic was at work. Within days, the police, under intense pressure to solve the case, began focusing on a group of local teenagers, boys who, in many ways, did not fit the mold of their quiet, conservative town. They dressed in black. They listened to heavy metal music. And they had reputations, earned or not, as outcasts. At the center of the police's attention was Damian Eccles, an 18-year-old with a history of mental health issues and a fascination with the occult. Damian stood out in West Memphis like a sore thumb. He dressed in dark clothes, he read books on witchcraft, and wrote poetry that explored themes of death and despair. He was the kind of young man whose presence in a deeply religious town like West Memphis was bound to attract suspicion, especially in the wake of such a grotesque crime. Alongside Damian were 2 other teenagers. Jason Baldwin, a quiet, introspective 16-year-old who had been Damian's best friend since childhood, and Jesse Miskelly, a 17-year-old with limited intellectual abilities, a boy who functioned on the fringe of both his social group and the town at large. The 3 of them, the police quickly decided, fit the profile of who could have committed such an atrocity. In a town gripped by fear and confusion, their differences, especially Damien's, made them easy targets. On June 3, 1993, the police brought in Jesse Miskelly for questioning. After hours of coercive interrogation, Jesse, who had an IQ of around 72, confessed to the crime. His statement, filled with inconsistencies and factual errors, would later be seen as the product of pressure and suggestion rather than a genuine admission of guilt. But for the police, and for many in the town, it was enough. Jesse claimed that he, Damien, and Jason had killed the boys as part of a satanic ritual. With that, the arrests were made, and the West Memphis Three were thrust into the national spotlight. The trial that followed in 1994 was a spectacle unlike anything West Memphis had ever seen. It was as much about the perception of the three young men as it was about the evidence, or the lack thereof, against them. For many, particularly those who had come of age during the tail end of the satanic panic that had gripped America in the 1980s, the narrative of Damien, Jason, and Jesse as devil-worshipping killers fit all too easily into their understanding of evil in the world. Satanic ritual abuse had been a hot topic in the years leading up to the murders, and though the hysteria had begun to wane by 1994, the fear of the occult was still very much alive in the hearts of many Americans. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and the confession of Jesse Miskelly. No physical evidence tied the boys to the crime, but the authorities painted a picture of Damien as a satanic mastermind, someone who had orchestrated the killings as part of a ritual sacrifice. Books on witchcraft and occult symbols found in Damien's possession were presented as proof of his involvement in dark forces. Damien's own aloof demeanor and lack of emotion during the trial did little to endear him to a jury already predisposed to see him as guilty. The media played a significant role in shaping the narrative. News outlets across the country sensationalized the case, focusing on the occult aspects and portraying the three as outcasts who had turned to evil. In a time before social media, television and newspapers were the primary sources of information, and the portrayal of Damien, Jason, and Jesse as dangerous deviants fed into the national fascination with the macabre. The defense attorneys struggled to counter this tide of hysteria, and, despite the lack of concrete evidence, the jury found all three guilty. Damien Echols, the ringleader, was sentenced to death. Jason Baldwin received life without parole, and Jesse Miskelly was sentenced to life plus 40 years. As Damien sat on death row, and Jason and Jesse languished in the harsh confines of prison, the world outside West Memphis began to change. The initial media frenzy over the case faded, but for some, the story of the West Memphis Three lingered, a nagging feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. In 1996, the documentary Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills premiered on HBO, and it would change everything. Filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky had been granted unprecedented access to the trial and to the families involved. What they captured was a trial marred by prejudice, flawed evidence, and a community so eager for justice that it had sacrificed three boys to their fears. The documentary showed the world what had been hidden beneath the surface of the sensational headlines. Damien, Jason, and Jesse were not the demonic figures they had been made out to be. They were kids. Damaged, yes, by circumstance and their own poor decisions, but hardly the architects of a ritualistic killing. The documentary raised questions about the fairness of the trial and the reliability of the evidence, and it found a receptive audience. As more people became aware of the case, the movement to free the West Memphis Three gained momentum. Celebrities like Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam and Natalie Maines of the Dixie Chicks took up their cause, using their significant platforms to draw attention to the injustice. A second documentary, Paradise Lost 2: Revelations, followed in the year 2000, further deepening public interest in the case. And soon, legal experts, journalists, and activists were working tirelessly to uncover new evidence to push for a retrial. And one of the key pieces of new evidence came in 2007, when DNA testing, which had not been available at the time of the original trial, revealed that none of the biological material found at the crime scene matched Damien, Jason, or Jesse. Instead, a hair found in the ligatures binding one of the victims was linked to a man named Terry Hobbs, who happened to be the stepfather of Stevie Branch, one of the 8-year-old victims. While this was not conclusive proof of Terry Hobbs' involvement, it cast significant doubt on the original investigation. And for years, the legal battle continued. Appeals were filed, rejected, but the tide was beginning to turn. By the late 2000s, it had become clear that the original convictions were deeply flawed. Public opinion, once so firmly against the three, had shifted. They were no longer seen as monsters, but as victims of a system that had failed them. In August 2011, after 18 years of imprisonment, the West Memphis Three were offered a rare legal arrangement known as an Alford plea. Under this agreement, they were allowed to assert their innocence while acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict them. It was a bittersweet compromise. Damien, Jason, and Jesse were free, but they weren't fully exonerated. The state simply refused to admit it had wrongfully imprisoned them. The three men emerged from prison into a world that had changed dramatically since their incarceration. Damien, whose time on death row had taken a severe toll on his mental and physical health, moved to New York, where he began to rebuild his life. He wrote a memoir, Life After Death, in which he recounted his experiences and the profound impact of nearly 2 decades spent under the specter of execution. Jason Baldwin, always the quietest and most introspective of the three, dedicated himself to criminal justice reform, working to prevent others from experiencing the same nightmare. Jesse Miskelly returned to Arkansas, where he struggled to adapt to life outside of prison, his limited cognitive abilities making the transition especially difficult. Though free, the West Memphis Three were left with a lingering sense of unfinished justice. Their convictions remained, even as the evidence of their innocence continued to mount. The real killers of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were never brought to justice. And for the families of the victims, closure remains elusive. The story of the West Memphis Three is one that forces us to confront the limits of human judgment, the dangers of moral panic, and the failures of a justice system that too often prioritizes expediency over truth. It's a story rooted in the complexities of American life, where fear of the unknown, suspicion of those who are different, and a hunger for justice can combine to produce tragic outcomes. In the years since their release, the case has continued to serve as a symbol of the need for reform. It's become a rallying cry for those who seek to end wrongful convictions and to bring greater transparency and fairness to the criminal justice system. The documentaries, the books, and the media attention that brought the case to light helped to change public opinion, but they also underscored the fragility of truth in a world where perception can so easily be manipulated. For West Memphis, the memory of those dark days lingers. The town, like so many others in rural America, is a place of resilience, shaped by the rhythms of life along the Mississippi River, but also marked by the scars of a tragedy that will never fully heal. The story of the West Memphis Three is not just about 3 boys wrongfully convicted of a terrible crime. It's about a society's rush to judgment, its capacity for fear in the long, painful journey toward redemption. It's a reminder that in the pursuit of justice, we must be ever vigilant, for the cost of getting it wrong can be devastating. Thanks for listening. Please make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also follow our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and now full episodes available on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.